Maybe I'm biased, but I think the best conversations about sports do intersect with finance. And I feel lucky to have what I think is the best panel of the day. So we're going to talk about all the forms of investment that are coming into the industry. But first I want to start with a poll, actually, for all of you, which is private equity investment a net positive for sports? I'll let you vote if you think yes or no, and then we'll talk to the rest of our panel about it. I think.
You didn't tell us. I didn't. That's not good.
You didn't sign up for this? Well, we're excited to see what you think. But while we answer this as well, I'm sure all of you have seen the news that the last major U.S. sports league in the United States has opened up to the idea of private equity investment. And actually, Don's company is one of the firms that have been approved in that process. Can you give us a little color on what that's like?
Yeah, it's super exciting. From a personal perspective, I got my career in sports started at the NFL. So 30 years ago, I worked at the league office. So it's sort of a full circle moment. More importantly, the NFL is the best content in the world, right? Not best sports content, literally the best content in the world. Tonight, probably 25 million people in the United States will watch the opening night of the season. And when you just think about how much the NFL is in people's zeitgeist, the opportunity is real. For us, as a firm, we're a year and a half old, to be able to partner with that league office in particular, which is fantastically run. You know, the way I think about it is we're partnering with a great set of assets with great management teams. Right? That's traditional private equity, and so we're super, super excited.
Now, before we move on from the NFL conversation, I know, and I have to admit, I stole this from our colleague Randall Williams. You guys are called the Avengers, apparently, in the background. The nickname Avengers is what they call the consortium that is investing in this. How did the Avengers come together?
That's just, I don't know where that came from.
I love Marvel, so I love it.
That is not a real name. Obviously, we can't get that trademark. I think people saw us walking through an office. It's a bunch of larger guys, and they just decided to call us the Avengers. Curtis Martin is a pretty athletic-looking guy, so.
Don had a cape on when he walked.
A mask.
We could see it. We could see it.
A hammer.
So lucky for you, most of the audience agrees. Private equity is a good thing.
Yay.
Colin, you can kind of open up to where private equity is making the biggest difference in all the teams you've worked across, all the leagues you've worked across.
Sure. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer because private equity has invested in sports assets for a long time. There are a lot of good examples. Following COVID, or really in the beginning of COVID, a lot of the leagues changed their rules, and so there was a huge rush of capital into the space. And Don probably remembers this as well from his earlier days. We used to have, maybe 4 or 5 traditional funds that would be interested in the sector. There's now 50, and I'm probably understating it, and that's really just U.S. So globally, there's a tremendous amount of interest. It's changed the way that we work with teams when we're raising capital or taking them to market for a sale, because your buyer universe is significantly expanded, in addition to just the way that you finance these deals. When we've sold a few of the big European football clubs the last couple of years, the access to financing, relatively cheap financing, I would say, enables other buyers, whether it's a high net worth or a sovereign or another institution, to pay higher prices. So generally been pretty good for the ecosystem.
We'll ask you about types of buyers in a minute. One kind of newer area for investors across the universe here has been in women's sports. And Jasmine, you're really at the forefront of that. How much interest is being drawn in now, and how has that changed the way you guys invest?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when Kara and I co-founded Monarch, it was really because I was sort of in the inside conversations when some of the men's leagues were starting to open up to private equity. And I was kind of watching that. And then I was watching what was happening around media rights and brand engagement and just fans showing up around women's sports. And I was like, why is no one putting these two things together? And it just felt like, to me, like if I'm going to go and invest in teams and want to see kind of like appreciation that could look like venture-like growth, it feels like that's really possible in women's sports. But in a space where there's still a lot of the same characteristics of downside protection that I think you see on the men's sports side of things. So, I think when we launched Monarch, people were kind of like, is women's sports big enough? Is it interesting enough? And I think now women's sports has really become so mainstream in the last 2 years since that happened. And I think just when we look across the ecosystem, sort of when companies in our portfolio are raising capital or otherwise, there's just a lot more educated buyers on this topic and a lot of interest. So it's exciting.
I think valuation is an interesting topic because, of course, as you've been saying, that getting in at a lower valuation presents that much bigger growth opportunity. How do you feel about this as well? When you're looking for a valuation play, do you look to women's sports more? Are there other areas that you're looking to as well lately?
So we do spend a lot of time on women's sports. Jasmine and I have spent a lot of time comparing notes, and we have gotten close in a few situations and continue to look hard for something great. So valuation is a topic that you guys always want to talk about, and I get it. I was actually doing some thinking. About 10 years ago, I was on a Bloomberg panel. It's this teeny little place in Chelsea. I think, Colin, you were on the panel with me.
I remember.
It was right after Steve Ballmer bought the Clippers. And I actually found an article that has me quoted. And I said at the time, 2014, that the $2 billion price wasn't crazy. Now, at that moment in time, Steve Ballmer was worth $22 billion. Steve is now worth $120 billion. So if the Clippers were sold today, the question is, what would Steve Ballmer be able to afford? I'd say a lot, right? So it's very possible for him to come up with 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, $20 billion if he wanted to. So the ability to pay is not an issue. Then the question is, what's the go forward, right? And what gets us excited, and I think Colin and Jasmine would agree, is technology coming into sport, right? And if I think about, my 5-year-old son over there, the way he interacts with sport is very different than the way I did, right? As a child, I was a Mets fan. The Mets never knew who I was, right? There was no relationship. Now, my son, my wonderful wife, they come to Knicks games with me. I am getting fed things in my phone on a daily basis, youth jerseys that are in his favorite color, purple. I'm getting fashion-forward Knicks gear because they think that my wife might like it. I guess she likes fashion. And so the fact is, all of a sudden now, there's a one-to-one relationship between the team and the league and the consumer. That leads to monetization. So as I think about where this is going, we couldn't be more excited.
I want to talk more about monetization in just a second, especially with the two of you. But I do want you first to call and answer, what's the end game? You have these new investment firms that are investing in different teams. Do they IPO? How do you exit? How do you find value? These are such new investments.
Yeah, look, I think the value is a long-term play in terms of the appreciation. I don't think, and Don should comment on this, but I don't think any of the funds that are approved for the NFL or any other leagues, as an example, are doing it for any other reason than they think it's a good investment that will appreciate in value and deliver returns to their LPs, which is their business at the end of the day, right? They don't get paid to manage money and not make money. Otherwise, they're going to be in business for not too long.
But if they can't exit, how do they make money or return that money to investors?
There are all sorts of ways you can structure exits in sports teams. I don't see a flood of teams going public over time. Typically, the private valuations for teams have far exceeded public valuations. We saw that in the transaction that we worked on with Manchester United earlier this year. But there are other ways that you can finance out your stake in a team, whether it's selling to someone else, the full team gets sold, which, we have a fund as well. Our thesis is a little bit more active management with our companies. And when you're investing in teams, you're more or less along for the ride, as Don said, with really good management teams. So you're betting on, what do they want to do with the team long term to some certain extent.
I'm curious, Jasmine, as to how you find value in teams as well. I've seen, for example, Sixth Street analysis that looked at the universe of women's soccer, but not women's soccer, in professional sports, youth soccer, to see what the future audience potential would be, the future potential is for this sport. How do you think about the growth rate of the teams you're investing in?
Yeah, I think kind of the way I think about it is like the universe of women's sports fans today are like the people that are gonna go search across like 7 different channels and download 4 different apps to find this content because they're rabid about the content. And I feel like now we're sort of progressively making it much easier to be a women's sports fan as this content's distributed more broadly. And these things are just sort of like the natural, real-world, in-person network effects, where it's like you're going to bring your friend to the sports bar and go watch the game together, and now they're going to tune in when they're sitting at home. And so I feel like it's like we're kind of hitting this inflection point in terms of, the fan base isn't super penetrated today, And if we look at the history of what happened in the men's leagues, I think there are going to be a handful of leagues on the women's side that really grow exponentially because of these sort of real person network effects. And so I think there's a ton of headroom.
And into the technology also, because now you have the technology companies that can go find the fan, right? If they know that you are somebody that is likely to want to watch an NWSL game, they will market it to you, right? If anybody here is signed up for Apple or Amazon or whatever it is, they're shooting notifications when the match is on, and you hit a button, next thing you know, you're watching it. That didn't exist 20 years ago, and I think that's where women's sports in particular are going to benefit, because they can find the fans and actually convert those fans to eyeballs.
And just to piggyback quickly on what Don said earlier about technology, if you rewind 3 or 4 years, people will remember the NFT craze. I didn't know what an NFT was in 2020, but that's come and gone. But there will be another version of another way to monetize this IP, which at the end of the day, it is the most powerful IP in the world. But I can't imagine what the next technological change that's going to drive revenue for the teams.
I want to talk more about this, because this is perhaps one of the most fascinating, kind of eye-popping moments, with changes in relationships with Amazon really creating a greater closeness to the NBA, maybe the WNBA. And then also, when you think about the deal they just struck with the Kelsey brothers, the $100 million podcast deal, just absolutely eye-popping. How do you see new media really changing the game, so to speak? Do you see the benefits immediately in terms of what Don and Colin are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, media coverage, sort of dimensionalizing the story, I think is really important, especially as you're onboarding fans into the ecosystem of women's sports, which I think is really like the position that we're in today. That being said, I think all content investment isn't good content investment, and so it can also be a place that you can dump a lot of cash and actually not have it be high ROI. And so I think it's kind of like everything. It's like finding the really exceptional operators who can take this content, these stories, these athletes, and really spin that into the narratives, distribute it in the right spaces to actually make it pay off. And I think that's really so important.
How do you monetize this opportunity, Colin?
Which opportunity specifically?
Around the technology, if there's new media flocking to the sports opportunity and a wider array of them, how does that translate into dollars when you're investing in a team?
I mean, just more ways to distribute content and charge for it. If I remember the CEO of Manchester City, or City Football Group, it's a group that we worked with for many years, used to say, if I can get £1 per fan, and they've got probably 750 million fans around the world, my business is going to take off. So that quite hasn't happened yet, but to Don's point, knowing who your customer is, which other industries have been far ahead of sports on doing, will lead to that eventually.
I also want to talk about some of the upcoming moments for sports. This summer, a lot of people have been paying a lot of attention to Caitlin Clark, but also, what about the World Cup and the LA Olympics? What does that provide for not basketball, but for soccer in the future?
Yeah, I think in soccer we have some really interesting moments coming up. So obviously you have the 2026 World Cup, the 2028 Olympics, and then hopefully in 2031 the U.S. Will host the Women's World Cup. And so all three are great sort of activation moments for soccer in the U.S. I mean, I remember looking at MLS teams back when I was at the 49ers and being like, I don't know, $100 million, can you pay this for an MLS team? And like just thinking about the fan base for soccer in the US, it's just matured so dramatically. And I think you're seeing that both in terms of demand for North American soccer content and global football content. And so I think that's one of the really interesting things about the space is we're going to really build this depth of fan base in North America where it still, I think, has tons of room for growth. But this is also, soccer's a global property. And so we've invested in 3 NWSL clubs because we feel really confident in the opportunity in global soccer and the structure of the league there.
So when I came into this conversation, I was thinking about it a lot in terms of what's the next wave. Where are the next types of leagues and teams to be investing in? And one thing that keeps on coming up in my travels is youth sports. And wondering how the two of you in particular see this opportunity, because I know that you're looking at it.
Well, Colin, why don't you start, because I need
Sure.
that investment.
Yeah, we have an investment in a company called RCX Sports, which essentially works with all the major U.S. leagues with their youth programs, notably NFL Flag. And so they help operate and run that program. It's a little bit of a... We had another business that was around youth recruiting, and so we sold that to IMG. And out of that, we sort of created our RCX, the business is growing at a rapid pace. And if you think about why the leagues want to develop that next generation of fan, it's a little bit what Don said earlier with his son, with my kids. Like, they're not watching sports the way that we did. So you have to get a fan earlier in their lifetime. And whether it's flag football or MLS or NBA, what they're doing with their youth leagues, you're grabbing someone early on. And if you get someone early on, especially for a sports team, I can speak at least for myself, you're a fan forever. And so we're pretty bullish on it. Growth rates are phenomenal. And I think you're going to see a lot more investment. And you're already seeing it right now.
I mean, to be fair, also, that is for the fans. But what about the players? There are a lot of parents who worry about the impact that this could have, the ripple down effect this could have across ages.
Yeah, I think private equity is looking for a return we're at Bloomberg conference, right? So people need to make money. So yeah, there are ways. I don't think you're going to be gouging parents for fees. I would argue that you're sort of maybe there already, but I don't see it increasing significantly more because you'll lose parents.
How do you feel about this?
Yeah, so a couple things on that point. I would say private equity is coming in to provide and help provide a better experience for parents, right? And I think this, just taking a step back, we've talked a lot about technology, and I think anybody who's a parent gets it that what we're trying to do is keep our kids away from the screen. And I'll tell a quick story. Again, I keep talking about my son because he's here. This past weekend, he was at a basketball camp. Spent an hour playing basketball. Then after that, he sat with the guys he was playing with. They're all 5, 6 years old, and they spent 30 minutes trading Pokemon cards, right? And I was looking at this and saying to myself, this is what I did when I was a kid, right? I think human beings still want to be with other human beings, right? It's not all about the screen. And so parents seeing this are willing to invest in it. Where we come in is, can we make sure it's happening in what I consider to be a value-add way? Right now, it's very mom and pop. Some experiences are good, some aren't bad. The coach doesn't show up, they're late, the coach doesn't know what they're doing. Private equity comes in and brings discipline and makes sure that the money that is being spent well.
At the end of the day, and with our last 5 minutes, I'd love to talk to each of you about what you think is the next best opportunity, where each of you are looking for your next investment, your next team to work with, your next set of owners. How do you define your next place to go, Jasmine?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe going back to something I said earlier, like, I do feel like there are going to be a handful of things in women's sports that really work, and then kind of the same thing that will happen on the men's side, which is that, like, there are a lot of sports leagues that are never going to hit that sort of escape velocity. And so we think a lot about how do you play in those spaces that you can feel really confident are going to take off in a world where we feel, well positioned to do that as the only fund focused on women's sports. And so, we're spending a lot of time on just like global football. So, we spend a lot of time in the U.S. around the NWSL, but thinking about what's possible in England and Europe more broadly is a big topic. Basketball is obviously like super interesting and something we've been working on for a number of years to find the right opportunity there. So I think we try to not sort of get excited about all of these sports, which I think will like grow and scale, but try to find those opportunities that really, can be the next major league or can continue to scale in that way.
To that end, do you feel like you're facing more competition in some of these asset classes?
Yeah, but candidly, I think that's a good thing. Like when we were writing our pitch deck for Monarch, like one of the things that we talked about is the success criteria was bringing more capital into the ecosystem. I think whenever you get into a space like this and it's so early, it's sort of like the more people that want to come play here, the better. And I think it'll sort of, there's plenty of room and I think returns to have. And I think it's just about making sure the people around the table are excited to make money, but are also excited to build this ecosystem, but really build it in the right way and show up and do the hard work to get there.
Colin, next best opportunity.
Next best. Whatever I'm working on next is what I would say is the next best. We have a couple different theses that we're exploring. Women's sports, like Jasmine, is a big focus for us. And we've had a couple advisory transactions, but we're looking to deploy our fund into something. I would say we've had a lot of success with emerging leagues. We were early investors in the PLL, which is the Professional Lacrosse League. They're thinking about expanding into women's as well, so that's something we're pretty excited about. And then I would say just globally, the U.S. market is not every sport, but is pretty mature in terms of what you can do. And so when we're underwriting to 3x cash-on-cash returns, we have to find things that are a little bit under the radar that have a longer runway. So we're looking overseas where there is a lot of commercialization yet to come, especially in Europe. I think what the NBA is thinking about doing in Europe is probably the most exciting thing I've heard in a long time.
I mean, it'd be hard for me not to say the NFL, and we will be spending a lot of time around the NFL in the near term. But I'd also say as this ecosystem of teams and leagues gets larger and larger, and there's more capital coming in, and there's better business models and more profitability, the operating companies that enable sport are super exciting to us, and we're spending a lot of time around that.